so JD doesn't think I'm slighting him, I will announce that this is JD Lewis.
Well, let's give a big round of applause to George and Carol for all their hard work. It is amazing what they've done. And I hate to say it, but what George said about 10 minutes, 15 minutes ago is 100% true. You're going to have a hook to pull me off here. I will do my best to wrap it up in an hour. That means that I'm not going to read every slide. There is a lot of information. Who here can name one of South Carolina's founding fathers? Francis Marion was one. Why was he a founding father? Because he led the militia, he was part of the Continental Army, and he was also a South Carolina senator. So he was one of our founding fathers. Can anybody name one more?
Hezekiah Man.
Who? Hezekiah Man is correct. I didn't hear it. Yes. Can anybody out here name a founding father? Okay. Can anybody name five? Don't do it. But raise your hand if you can name five. Who can name 50? Who can name 1,072? You will be able to do it after today because Carol is going to pass out CD-ROMs of everything that I talk about today because you don't want to take notes. You just want to sit back and listen. And if it gets to be too much, just close your eyes and take a nap.
Charles Baxley.
Okay. Last year I gave a similar presentation to a group in North Carolina. So I know that some of you folks are from North Carolina. You're going to get a CD-ROM with both the North Carolina presentation and the South Carolina presentation. You're also going to get Excel spreadsheets with all the people named and where they're from. Okay? So, I appreciate all of you taking time out of your busy schedule and coming here today. What I want to do is let you know that this presentation tells a lot of stories. It's not so much that there are 1,072 founding fathers. It is not to disparage the women. It is to just let you know that the founding fathers were old white men who could vote. That was the way it was at the time. Okay? Matter of fact. There are several stories to let you know that not only are you going to get the names, but you're going to see what they did and why they were considered founding fathers. And another story you're going to see is that they didn't just make it up out of the air. They had stuff to base it on. They had history that they came up with. So the way that this country was founded as the first constitutional republic in the world that survived. We had a constitution, U.S. Constitution in 1788. There were two other small countries that set up a constitutional republic in the 1750s and the 1760s in Europe, but they didn't survive more than a couple of years. This one survived. But our U.S. Constitution was done in 1788. South Carolina created a state constitution in 1776. 12 years before the nation. South Carolina was the second to create a state constitution. I forget which was first. South Carolina was second. Massachusetts?
South Carolina is still a nation.
South Carolina is still a nation, I agree. So, without further ado, we're going to run through this quickly. If I go too fast, you're welcome to raise your hand and get me to stop. You really don't need to ask questions at the end, not that I mind it, because you're going to get everything on the CD-ROM, but I'll answer any question you have. It's just that I know most of you want to go to lunch. So we're going to get out of here before lunch, I promise. However, warning, this is a data-intensive presentation. Your eyes are going to glaze over and you're going to get frustrated. Somewhere you're gonna get bored, get up, walk around. But once we get into the real presentation, you're gonna see that I'm gonna have dates up here in the corner, so that if you fall asleep, you wake back up, you'll know where you're at. We'll go. All right, so we're gonna look back at, quickly, representative government. We'll look back at South Carolina government from the beginning to the Revolution. Then we go to the Revolution, South Carolina joined the United States, and then there's a big hindrance in a lot of things. So, representative government. We're going to talk a lot about democracy, constitutions, etc. If you look back in history, that the first democracies were probably established when the hunter-gatherers voted with their feet to stop huntering and gathering and start farming. So they made some votes then and they decided, okay, I'm tired of this running around, we're going to settle down. But the word democracy comes from the Greeks, and a lot of people know of the Roman republics, but most people aren't aware that the Indian subcontinent established democracies around the same time as everybody else. They also established constitutions, or what we would consider to be constitutions. A lot of the folks that were living back then, if they were to come alive today, they would recognize a lot of the things that they established 2,500 years ago. Some of them would be scratching their heads over what they see, but they would recognize it. So, take a look at England. England was taken over by the Normans in 1066, Battle of Hastings, and over a period of time, they came up with a democracy. Their democracy is based on an unwritten constitution, but evolved over time, starting with the Magna Carta in 1215. This was essentially a great council that was only called when the king wanted it. They came up with Knights of the Shire, and they started establishing a parliament. The first parliament was not elected. It was named. Then they came to England and Wales, created a bicameral parliament, and you start seeing during the 1600s is when things really evolved. There's something magical about the 1600s in the United Kingdom that brought about the form of freedom that we have today. They had the English Civil War in the 1640s. King Charles was overthrown and beheaded. Charles II was reinstated. They had a great Reformation. The Glorious Revolution was when William and Mary overthrew James, and they reinstated Protestantism, but they created the Bill of Rights during that time. It went on to the Great Britain, which was Scotland and Northern Ireland. Then the United Kingdom included Ireland, and over time you see all the kings and queens that happened, or that existed during that time. Great Britain's constitution was essentially sealed in 1689. Okay, that was the Bill of Rights created by William and Mary. It was based on some things. There were other things that happened. To this day, England does not have a written constitution, but they are considered a constitutional monarchy. Their constitution is in the form of 5 or 6 documents. Okay? So, furthermore, the original 13 colonies, which we know were based upon English law and English rule, had charters. Each of the groups that came over to these colonies were granted a charter to a proprietor, a group of proprietors, or to companies. Like the Virginia Company in Virginia in 1607, they had a corporate charter. The charters spelled out what the proprietors had to give to their people. The charters were almost considered a constitution. They didn't really use that term back then. They called them a charter. And as you see, this is in order of north to south. They had a patent and a royal charter. They had a compact, they had charter. All of them had charters except for Delaware, because at the time Delaware, when it was first settled, it was part of Pennsylvania. So So each were granted charters. All of them were given royal charters except for Pennsylvania. There it is. They never corrected the proprietor charter. Virginia was the first one chartered. And oh, by the way, the Connecticut Charter or Legislative Fundamental Order was a basis for their initial state constitution, and that's why it's called the Constitution State. So you see the term constitution, charters, etc. There's a lot happening in the 1600s. You know, South Carolina was founded in 1670. The Old North State started out in 1663. That's why they call themselves the Old North State. But the first representative government in the New World was at Jamestown. And it was in 1619 that they authorized to create an assembly. Folks, that's 399 years ago. Next year they're going to be celebrating the 400th year of representative government in the colonies. Amazing stuff. They were called burgesses. They first met for less than a week. They set the floor price for tobacco, local natives, and settled a few criminal cases. Representative government has begun in the colonies. That didn't take too long. So now we'll go through South Carolina. Actually, the two Carolinas, but focusing on South Carolina. Carolina was granted by Charles I to his Attorney General, Robert Heath, in 1629. He gave him a charter. Nothing happened. Robert Heath didn't have the wherewithal to establish a colony here. There were a lot of plans for a colony. There were a lot of machinations in England, but it just never happened. So what happened to that first charter? It got ignored until the second one was released. In 1663, Charles II issued a charter to 8 Lords Proprietors. We all know the Lords Proprietors. This was when things really got sticky because now folks who were involved in the first one started suing the people that got the second one. And it really didn't stop for quite a few years. But the 8 original Lord Proprietors are all there. We have portraits of all of them except one. Could never find John Colleton. And you'll note that these two also settled New Jersey, and this guy was also the governor of Virginia. A lot of these folks later got accused of crimes. They fell out of favor with Charles II. Those people don't know. Well, I'll get into that in a minute. Carolina Charter, 1663, you're going to see that their 8 trusty and well-beloved cousins and counselors have blah, blah, blah. The original charter right now exists in the North Carolina State Archive, and it is almost constitutional-like. They issued a second one 2 years later with unnumbered paragraphs, and they extended the northern boundary by 30 minutes, and it says that they have to obey the laws of England. So even though we can come here and set up a representative government in South Carolina and North Carolina, you got to follow the laws of England. You cannot make laws contrary to it. They demanded religious freedom. This is 1663, 1665. This is the 1600s. This is 100 years before our revolution. They had 2 written decrees that they gave mostly to the North Carolinians because Charleston wouldn't settle it. 1663, 1665, they spelled out what the Lords Proprietors could do and what they could not do, and it was signed by King Charles II. 1669, the Carolina Fundamental Constitutions were issued and handed to the 3 ships that came over in 1670 and settled at Albemarle Point were to follow the fundamental constitutions as written mostly by John Locke. Recent discoveries have learned that maybe Locke didn't have as much to do with it as they originally thought, that Anthony Shaftesbury, there you go, keep reading the last name, most of it. He was the moving force behind it. I don't know which is true. Locke did have a lot of influence, but this is 1669. This is not the first written constitution, but it is the first one imposed in the colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. You will see that the purpose of this Constitution was to avoid the creation of a democracy. The late Lord Proprietors wanted complete control over their domain, and they tried to set up all kinds of ways to keep control of that domain. They set up their own titles of landed gentry, which the king said, you can't use anything that we have over here like dukes and earls, so you can use anything else you want. You can have a local government, but they can't pass any laws that aren't contrary to English law. But we really don't want a democracy. So the original governors that were sent over here were sent over with explicit instructions on what to do and what not. Only last point to make here is, this is the 1600s. It was revised many times. And in 82 it was revised twice. In 98 the constitutions were revised again. And everybody essentially ignored them because they contradicted the charter, they contradicted the concessions and agreements that had been issued a few years earlier. However, they were acknowledged as being useful documents. Another point to make, I'm sorry, that was final. It was, oops, went the wrong way. Commonwealth of Oceania was written in 1650, and it was about a utopian government and how to set up the perfect government with 3 parts: legislative, executive, and judicial. This was written during the English Civil War. Cromwell hated it and had it banned, but almost everybody read it. There are some bases of our current stuff in this book in 1653. All right, what most people don't realize is there were 46 Lords Proprietors. One died, his son inherited it, or a group of people inherited it, or he sold it. Over a period of 1663 to 1729, there were 46 Lords Proprietors. Here are all of them in order, and as you'll see, only 4 of them ever came to the colonies. Okay, 2 were in South Carolina, Joseph Blake and his son. His son was born in 1700, he died in 1700, so he took over as a Lord Proprietor, and he owned it for 29 years. This is the only guy that never sold his share to the crown. And so this is Earl of Granville, John Carteret. They set aside a big swath of land in North Carolina, and he got to sell it off for many years, the Granville tract. So 46 Lord Proprietors, only 4 of them ever came. One was John Archdale, another is Seth Sothel. There he is. Seth Sothel was a rascallion. So there it is in timeline format. So if you want to look at any point in time and say, who was the Lord Proprietor? There they are. Who cares? 1769. The fundamental Constitution spelled out the hierarchy, and the oldest Lord Proprietor was called a Palatine. Now there was a group of people in Europe called the Palatines. They were the Swiss and the Germans, okay? Not to be confused with this dude. This dude just had a title called Palatine. The oldest guy was a Palatine, and he was the one that got to select the governor for North Carolina and South Carolina. So from 1669 to 1718 in South Carolina, the Palatine chose the governor if they had to replace him. And then the other 7 proprietors got to select deputies. The deputies were to be the executive council for the governor. Don't know if you folks realize it. This colony was originally set up to be designed to be one province. But from the get-go, it was segregated. There was a group established in Albemarle in 1663. The first governor of North Carolina in 1664, William Drummond. Nobody even thought about Ashley River or Albemarle Point or Oyster Point. North Carolina had 3 or 4 governors before the first group came. There was Clarendon County, which we're in right now. It was a different one. It was around Cape Fear. Clarendon County established a group there with about 800 settlers. It lasted 3 years. Category 5 hurricane came through and wiped them out, and they all had to leave. Everybody thinks they jumped on ships and went somewhere, but they didn't. The hurricane destroyed their colony. They had to walk to Albemarle. That was the closest. Can you imagine walking from the Cape Fear River to Albemarle region, which is, Edenton, that area, in August? All right, so the Palatines were the eldest. The nobility of Carolina was a landgrave with 48,000 acres of land, a cacique, which is an Indian term, which means headman. They got 24,000 acres of land, and then they had a baronet, which got up to 12,000 acres. 1705, they created a Carolina Herald, and one was named, I don't know how many acres he got. Point is, all these people really existed, and some of them got over 100,000 acres of land. And there were fights as to, based on the fundamental Constitution, if a governor dies in office, the oldest living landgrave gets to be governor. Oh, that caused a few fights. All right, so from 1670 in South Carolina up until the last one, there were a total of 32 unique leaders in 105 years. These were appointed by the Lord Proprietors. 1719, South Carolina rose up and said, enough. You're sending bozos to lead us. We want to have better leaders. So the Crown took over the state of the government, governing in South Carolina in 1719. They didn't buy the colony until 1729. But they took over South Carolina in 1719. They didn't do it until 1729 in North Carolina. But as you see, some folks have an asterisk, and they were not elected or given. These people were the head of the executive council, and when this guy died, he was acting governor until the next one was appointed. Came over. William Bull and his son William Bull Jr. Look at that. They basically ran South Carolina during the royal time. And they were pretty decent fellows. The only problem is that as time went on, the instructions to these governors got stricter and stricter and stricter. And the Lord Proprietors and the Royal Crown said, go in and enforce this, go in and do this, go in and take back control of the General Assembly, go in and browbeat, we want. So that gave the governors way too much power, according to the nobles, and they resented the heck out of it. And that was true in South Carolina, North Carolina too. But just taking a look at it real quickly, you had a governor with an executive that was appointed by the Palatine. He has secretaries, and these were all appointed by the Palatine. Executive council with 7 deputies. They had a Commons House of Assembly. This was considered the upper house, the lower house, and the group was called the General Assembly. Okay, at some point they came up with Chief Justice, and they were somewhat separated from the governor, but the governor could still almost always override the Chief Justice, unless the Chief Justice jumped on a ship and went back to England to complain, which happened quite a bit. So, taking a look at 1692, we know who most of the people are. We know who the executive council was. These were the deputies of these Lord Proprietors. The Commons House of Assembly was based upon the 3 counties at that point in time, And they were each authorized 10 delegates, and they did pass laws. So one of the things that you're going to see that Carol is handing out is a synopsis or a highlight of the known laws passed by the Colonial General Assembly. So you're going to get a hard copy of this, one for each table. And the point being is that they did pass over 1,000 laws. But when you start looking at them, the first one that they know is the observance of the Lord's Day. We're going to pass a law for that. Suppression of idle, drunken, and swearing persons. Lay out roads and highways, establish a militia, and we got to have money for the public officials. That was in 1680. Only passed 5 laws. Over the next 100 years, they passed 1,000 laws, and they ran everything from regulating Indian trade to regulating the election of the General Assembly, public houses, setting up a post office. The biggest one was the Church Act of 1705, where they established the parishes and made it England, Church of England as the official religion for the colony. But this is your first. This is way too early. As you can see, there were 3 counties at first. Carteret County got created in 1694 and was renamed Granville County in 1708. So here it shows none of these counties were surveyed. They were just based upon rivers. And I can read this. There it is. Craven County ended at Allendale Creek. I was mentioning that to Ed earlier this morning. So they were all based upon rivers and creeks, and they were never surveyed. From 1705 to 1775, they created 24 parishes of the Anglican Church. They created 7 overarching judicial districts, and then they created, they kept the old 4 counties, sorry. So you got to have a magic decoder ring to figure out who were elected to be members of the General Assembly of the state of South Carolina. And every one of these, the parishes first, starting in 1605, then the overarching counties, and then the counties were supposedly gone, but they weren't gone. More about that in just a minute. So under the Crown, the only changes were that the Crown got to appoint the governor, the Crown got to appoint the executive council, which grew to 20, and they got to select a few more people at the lower level. That's all that changed under the Crown. So the royal governors of South Carolina were appointed on the advice of the Secretary of State and accountable to the Secretary of State and the Board of Trade. And they were given explicit instructions of, here's what we want you to do. And let's make life difficult for the local colonists. Quick look at Johnson's government. I could come up with most of the names, but I could only find 2 of the 20 executive council. By now, the Commons House of Assembly was solely based on parishes. And as you can see, some parishes were given more men than others. This was the 10th in 1733. This is the map for the representative for that year. Here are the overarching judicial districts in 1769. They were proposed in 68, not accepted, and finally accepted in 1769. The final one for the royal government was Hamilton. I could not dig out the names of any of his executive council. The Commons House of Assembly, you'll see who were named. You will find out that a lot of these folks transitioned over to the Patriot cause in 1775. So that's a look back at South Carolina, the roads, we get to the American Revolution. This is when it gets fast and furious. I will make it. Top left corner, here's your year, 73, 74. We all know about the Quartering Act, we know about the Tax Stamp Act, we know the reasons why everybody rebelled and said, okay, we need to break away from the mother country, but we really don't want to do that. But what a lot of people don't know is that Benjamin Franklin was sort of the instigator. In 1773, he was the first to call for a Continental Congress. Of course, at that point in time, they just called it, let's have a Congress. But they didn't know anything about other than one. It was the Congress. So, all during 1773, he pushed for it, and December 73, South Carolinians assembled. They were not sanctioned. January 74, they appointed a big committee. 1774, July, they elected 104 representatives to send out. They elected 5 people to go to the first Continental Congress in Philadelphia. There's your first five of your founding fathers right there. The ones that were sent to Philadelphia in 1774, 75. In 74, they called for a provincial Congress, they had elections, and in January 75, they convened, they held a Council of Safety. These are the next big names of, you might not know these names. These are crucial South Carolinians that helped establish the beginnings of our state. Henry Lawrence was president of the council. They elected new delegates to the Second Continental Congress. There's your 5 that were elected. And then Henry Middleton was elected president of the Second Continental Congress, but he declined at this point. So they met again in Charleston in June. They set up 3 regiments of regimental troops. The key issues for this Congress was prohibiting exports to Great Britain, setting up observation and inspection, oath of association, and the 3 regiments. They then had elections for the second provincial Congress. But here you're going to see a slight deviation of our 4 counties, our 7 districts, and our 24 parishes. This provincial council decided we need a little more granularity in our voting systems. South Carolina at this stage decided to go with the term district. You know that counties here were not called counties until after the Civil War. They were called districts. And the reason they were called districts was they were election districts. That was what was important to them, was the electoral viewpoint. The parishes were not only ecclesiastical breakdowns, but they were also electoral breakdowns. So they decided to come up with ways to give representation based on population. God, who would have thought of that? All the councils before, all the general assemblies before, were not. Everybody got 3, everybody got 4. Here, they decided it's based on population, and we've got to break it up into population groups that make sense to us. And what makes sense to us is parishes and districts. Parishes and districts. We got the new acquisition district. We got a district between, we got the 96 overarching district, but St. Mark's Parish is over here. Saxe-Gotha, St. Matthew's Parish. We have parishes in the Low Country, and over here, but then over here we got districts. And you're like, who the hell thought this up? My goodness, could it get any more crazy? And guess what it does? We digress. The first provincial Congress, they decided this group gets the biggest number. Duh. Wonder why. That's where the rich planters were. The rich people. Anyway, it just gives you an idea of who was elected from each overarching district, the new electoral districts, and The names in blue also served on the colonial assembly. So the people in black are brand new. And they elected a total of 183 or 93 in the first and 214 in the second. These are the people, every name on here is one of your founding fathers, and you know where they're from. Beautifully in the 1970s, South Carolina legislature authorized funding for a big group to sort all this out, and they had a group of historians that dug through all of this, and they published a set of books in the late 70s, and they had got a biography of every one of these men. Some are only about this long, some are 5 pages, but it is wonderful that South Carolina did that. There is not a name not known. There is not a location not known. There is one assembly, which is the Second General Assembly, where the journals are lost. We sort of had to guess where they were represented. We got to list the names from the newspapers somewhere, but those people in the 1970s, those bios for everyone. And you find these in your bigger libraries. Okay. They also created a militia, and they created provincial troops, and based on my opinion and several other historians, all field officers would be considered founding fathers. A field officer would be a colonel, lieutenant colonel, and major. Later they created generals, so generals would become a founding father also. A purist would say that every man who fought on the Patriot side could be considered one of our founding fathers too. So down to the lowliest private or fifer or drummer, that's 25,000 men. I didn't think you wanted to be with this all 25,000. They're not in here. So we go from the field officers to the civilian government. In 1775, second